And a crackdown on climate protests features in the Queen's speech, with harsher sentences for those who disrupt travel. Hello and welcome to the UK's only daily climate news show, where we track the changes happening to our world, hear from the people being hardest hit by those changes, and report on the race for solutions. So, when COP26 concluded, its president proudly boasted that the goal of limiting global temperature rises to 1.5% had been kept alive. But now the Met Office is warning there's a 50-50 chance of that threshold being exceeded within 5 years. And as you can see on our data dashboard, the average global temperature is closing in on that 1.5 figure. For all the details on that story, here's our climate change correspondent, Hannah Thomas-Peter.
In India and Pakistan, a severe and unrelenting heatwave has killed dozens of people. This extreme heat, just one consequence of global warming. Now, a UK Met Office report suggests we could be heating up even faster than previously thought.
We should be concerned. This is more evidence that climate change is progressing, that in the future it's going to get warmer, and that climate extremes are going to get worse. So I think you should be worried. We should be trying to think about how, as a country, we can make contributions to cutting greenhouse gases.
The report predicts that over the next 5 years, the average global temperature could be between 1.1 degrees Celsius, where it is now, and 1.7 degrees higher than pre-industrial levels. And the chance of temperatures in at least one of those years exceeding 1.5 degrees is now nearly 50-50. On top of that, there's over a 90% chance of the average temperature for the coming 5 years being higher than the previous 5. It makes the Paris Climate Conference, where the ambition to try to limit warming to 1.5 degrees was first agreed on, seem like a long time ago.
I do think it's still achievable, but it will take an effort like we've never seen before from governments, from populations, from citizens. It will be, it's the greatest challenge that mankind's ever faced, to try and completely turn the direction on where our emissions are heading, to rewrite the global economy so that it actually delivers for the planet and not for pollution. It's going to be a monumental challenge.
Climate change is a threat that has loomed for decades. Now it is here. The effects felt not just in the global south, but all over the planet. We may still be wrestling with how to tackle it, but scientists have never been clearer. The window for meaningful action is rapidly closing. Hannah Thomas-Peter, Sky News.
And you can track global warming with our live counters that use data from leading climate change scientists, as well as the National Grid on the Sky News website. Well, climate protesters that glue or lock themselves to key transport infrastructure could soon face harsher prison sentences. It's all part of the government's plans to crack down on protests set out in the Queen's speech today. But is there too much focus on those demonstrating rather than the wider issue? Our reporter Aisha Zahid is here. Thanks so much for joining us. Good to see you in the studio. First of all, just set out for us what those road-blocking climate change protesters can expect.
Well, this is really targeting those groups like Extinction Rebellion, Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil. And it's all about combating those really disruptive tactics that we've seen over the last couple of months. We've seen Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil. They've blockaded bridges and roads. They've glued themselves to roads, and they've also paralysed oil refineries. Now, this new legislation will mean that, first of all, police have extended stop and search powers. And then on top of that, several other things will become offences. Included in that is locking on. So locking on to people, to objects, to buildings will become an offence, alongside obstruction of major transport works, things like HS2 And those two things will carry a maximum prison sentence of up to 6 months or an unlimited fine, or potentially both. And then on top of that, any interference with infrastructure, things like airports, railways, that will also become an offence carrying a maximum prison sentence of up to 12 months, potentially an unlimited fine, or again, potentially both.
OK, so what has the opposition said, or civil liberties groups as well?
Well, it's been criticised because this isn't the first time we've seen these measures. Initially, the government brought them forward whilst discussing the police crime sentencing and courts bill. That went to the House of Lords, and that's where it was knocked back. It was deemed that these measures they were controversial, so they were scrapped. And then later on, that bill was passed. So the chief executive of the group Fair Trials, they campaign for fairness, equality and justice. The chief executive has said that reintroducing these measures that were once scrapped goes to show that the government's intent is to, what they say, destroy the right to peacefully protest rather than to protect it. So real concerns here over freedom of expression and the right to protest.
OK, Aisha, thank you very much for that. Well, let's take a look, shall we, at some of the day's other climate news now, because countries across southern Europe have been setting new records for the amount of power generated from wind and solar farms. And figures from the think tank Ember show that those green energy sources accounted for 40% of Spain's electricity last month, while it was over a quarter in Italy. Greece and Portugal also set new records for solar generation. Well, sales of used cars, electric cars, have reached new record highs, and figures out from the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders show more than 14,500 battery electric cars were purchased in the first 3 months of this year. Now, that's more than double the total bought in the same period last year. New figures from climate charity Possible has shown the aviation industry missed all but one of over 50 climate targets it set itself over a 20-year period. The research blamed a lack of reporting and public accountability for a failure to hit targets on energy efficiency, to save fuel, and on increasing sustainable fuels. Well, we talked earlier about the threshold of 1.5 degrees potentially being exceeded within 5 years. But of course, that figure is just a global average. And some countries like India and Pakistan are already coping with extreme temperatures. In its latest report, the IPCC warned India will suffer more frequent and intensive heat waves as well as extreme rainfall events. Well, today it was 39 degrees in the industrial city of Kanpur in India, and it could be as hot as 44 degrees by Friday, while in Jaipur temperatures could reach 45 degrees Celsius by the end of the week. But what are governments in those countries doing to alleviate the crisis? Well, joining me now is Suruchi Badwal, Director at the Energy and Resources Institute in India and a lead author on the IPCC. Also, thank you so much for joining us, Suruchi. Can you tell me how hot it is where you are and how you're coping?
Yeah, so the temperatures are way above 42, 44 degrees centigrade. We are a country in the tropics and normally experience extreme temperatures during the summer. But what has been unusual for us in the summer is that in the month of March and April, as soon as, like we had the winters basically coming to a close and the spring season approaching, we had temperatures spiraling and being way above the normals that we are used to experience in these 2 months. And therefore, as a result, we have the heat wave condition that has gotten created in large parts of the country.
And what impacts is the heat waves having, Suruchi, on just normal life? I know it's devastating crops, but how are people managing to cope in these extreme heats?
Yeah, so ideally there are different ways in which responses are structured. Over the years, the government has set up an early warning system where cities are basically provided in advance a 3 to 5 day forecast with regard to the kind of temperatures that are likely to prevail. And therefore, governments at the subnational scales basically could take some corrective steps to assist people and help people in coping with the situation. There are simple things in terms of basically providing advisories to people in terms of staying indoors, avoiding outdoor labor during peak hours and staggering work hours in the morning and the evening. Of course, it does affect the productivity of people and their contributions. Also in terms of, setting up public places for provision of drinking water to avoid dehydration and heat strokes. So these are simple measures basically that are being put in place. But of course, there are ad hoc measures that people are also being advised to as do's and don'ts. While the rich may and the people who have the facilities and access to cooling devices may be increasing the number of hours for which they are running the devices. Maybe it was 8 hours and 10 hours before, but it's 12 to 14 hours and 16 hours now that people are basically in their houses running these the air conditioning units to help them cope with the situation. But the poor and the vulnerable who do not have access to these devices, possibly looking at ad hoc measures in terms of basically using gunny bags, wet gunny bags as a cooling means of air passing through their doors and windows.
A desperate situation, Suruchi, and you paint that picture quite strongly. How do you think India needs to adapt, and how soon do you think that change needs to happen?
So I do feel that we have to have global goals set in terms of containing the rate at which the changes in the climate are basically happening. You did mention about the 1.5 degrees C commitment linked to the discussions in Paris, and definitely that's an unachievable goal, frankly speaking, because we are already 1.5 degrees into the change itself, and we're still experiencing the changes. And of course, we may pass the 1.5 degree goal, but possibly, I think we need global collective action, which at least contains the globe to a 2 degrees centigrade and below world, so that the impacts that we are likely to face in the next coming decades, whether it's India or any other region in the world, in the form of any other extreme like floods, cyclones, tornadoes, storms, while we are hit by a heat wave in the central and the western parts of India, the eastern part of India is going to experience a cyclone incidence. So we are, doubly basically exposed right now by a cyclone on one hand and with the heat wave condition on the other. So I think we need to basically have collective action to be able to contain the rate at which the climate is basically changing, contain the rate of emissions that are being contributed to the atmosphere, and increase in the greenhouse gas concentrations, so that these forms of extremes can be limited. We will be into some degree of change with regard to the climate because we've already committed the world to that change. But I think the extremity of it, things to worsen than where we are today, that is something where we should be focusing as a world, and nations have to come together to be able to give that global commitment.
OK, Suruchi, thank you very much for your insight there. More to come on that story, I'm sure, in the next few days. Well, do stay with us. Coming up, I'll be joined with economist Vicky Price and climate columnist for The Independent, Donica McCarthy. We'll be discussing the warning from the Met Office about a 50-50 chance of exceeding a global warming threshold, and how Spain and Italy are hitting new records with renewable energy. See you soon.
United Kingdom. These last few years have seen some huge stories. And these stories have been driven by politics, by politicians, the people in power.
You must stay at home.
And it's my job to figure out how these decisions made by politicians impact all of us in our everyday lives.
This is the worst thing I've ever been through in my life.
People turn up here with their child stuff in a black sack and just say, I don't want to.
And that is what it is. It's first-class poverty.
Is this an example of the welfare state failing?
We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
These are stories that affect us all. Millions of children are now having to catch up. Some stories have changed all of our lives. Because like the residents, the staff are being infected. Politicians, they make decisions all of the time, and it's our job to hold them to account.
I wonder if you will take this opportunity to apologise to those families.
But in the end, the real power doesn't actually lie with the politicians. The real power lies with the people. I'm Nick Martin. I'm the People and Politics correspondent at Sky News.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Climate Show on Sky News. We're getting straight into discussing the issues of the day with economist Vicky Price and climate columnist for The Independent, Donica McCarthy. Hello both, thank you so much for joining us this evening. So our first big topic then, a new report from the Met Office says there's now that 50-50 chance we'll exceed the key 1.5 degree threshold for global warming, and that's within the next 5 years. Donica, I'll start with you. How worried are you by that?
Well, it's very clear now that what the government said after COP was untrue. We haven't saved a chance of avoiding 1.5 degree rise. That means that that is now guaranteed to happen. And what we are now facing is a desperate battle, not just to save 2 degrees, but we're heading fast through 3 degrees. What we're actually now witnessing with the terrible stories across the global south, India, Pakistan, is unfolding the greatest act of eco-terrorism in human history. And we're still failing to tackle or even begin to reduce our emissions. We're in code red, as the UN General Secretary has said.
So code red from Donica. Vicky, what's your thoughts on this? It's that 50-50 chance. Are you worried that we could tip the scale and it could go higher?
Well, of course, I think the scientists here, have something to tell us. And if the Met Office is looking at what's likely to happen, then we've got to take that very, very seriously. And it is true that what is happening right now is that, if anything, we are reversing a little bit the progress that had been made because of the impact of the war in the Ukraine. And we're seeing what's going on in Europe, where a number of things are now being abandoned. Particularly, for example, in some countries, the surcharge for renewable energy, which the electricity bills that households get include. So we've seen cuts in VAT for fuel and so on. So, and of course, a real concern about where the gas and the oil is going to come from. So everyone is trying to find different sources of where that fossil fuel can come from. So yes, of course, there is some renewed emphasis also on finding alternatives and a lot more green alternatives, but it takes time. And I suspect that within 5 years, we're going to be wondering what more needs to be done in terms of technology in particular to get us over this hump. And I think it is going to be a serious problem. And I don't think the policies we have at present are going to get there. And I'm afraid I agree, really, that it is a serious, serious issue. I'm afraid, wherever you're looking at it from, it is actually pretty worrying. And I don't think policies at present are there to address it.
So, Donica, where does the responsibility lie with government, with big businesses, with us as individuals to collectively do our bit?
Well, I would argue, first and foremost, it's actually with the media. The media isn't communicating. The corporate media, not so much obviously this programme, but the corporate media are selling an idea that we can continue business as usual. They're actually calling the protesters eco-terrorists, and they're refusing to call to account the oil corporations, the banks and the government. They're actually fueling this fossil fuel bonanza. The reaction by the United Kingdom government to the war in Ukraine is unlike the European Union. The European Union says we must go full speed ahead on green energy and energy efficiency. The response by the UK government was we must go full speed ahead with North Sea oil and gas and consider fracking. And they're actually continuing the ban on onshore wind and doing nothing but solar, the two cheapest forms of renewable energy, and nothing on energy efficiency. Today's Queen's speech should have had an energy efficiency bill. It reduces bills for working people and reduces carbon emissions. And so really, we have a failure across our establishment, whether it's media, government, oil corporations, and more importantly, the banks.
So, Vicky, what do you think are the solutions here? Because there must be an answer that we can do something to make a difference.
Huge investment, I'm afraid, is the only answer. I don't really agree that the Europeans are doing it right, because they themselves are, as I was saying, going backwards, and they're trying to find other sources of fossil fuel, frankly, for the time being. Yes, of course, little bits are being done, but I think huge investment and cooperation is absolutely essential, and working a lot more closely together. That's the one thing that the Europeans are getting right, trying to buy gas, for example, altogether, or also investing in the future in renewable energy and sharing it between them much more than was the case before. But these things will take time, and I think it is the investment side that matters hugely. And I think given that the world is slowing down and a lot of money will not be coming in the way that perhaps they had all anticipated, I fear that some of that investment is just not going to materialise in the time scale we want.
So, Donica, we're running out of time. Do you feel hopeless when you hear the Met Office coming out with this 1.5 figure, and we're looking at global temperatures and they're rising? Do you think it will tip over the edge?
Well, I think, as your speaker from India said, there is no chance now of avoiding 1.5 degrees. We have to accept that. If it could happen in the next 5 years, it will definitely happen within 10 years. So what we're now in a desperate battle not to avoid 2 and 3 degrees. And Vicky is right about that. Finance is crucial to this. And what we should have had today was a fossil fuel finance criminalisation bill that would make it illegal to pour hundreds of billions of pounds into new fossil fuels. And that needs to be agreed by the UK, the European Union, and by the UN in October. We must stop pouring money into our destruction. It's a crime against humanity. And the government needs to wake up to that and stop imprisoning the desperate young people that are saying to the government, you must act to save our lives. Today, as we sit here, there's 8 young people sitting in remand in jail today simply for standing in front of an oil refinery with a placard calling for action.
So it's interesting that you should say that, Donica, because the Queen's speech today didn't make any reference to climate change as such, but there was a focus, Vicky, wasn't there, on protesters. What did you make of that?
I think they're using that as an excuse for a wider clampdown on protests, and I think that's a bit of a worry.
Look, sorry, carry on. No, I was quite interested in where you were going with that, yes.
Well, yes, and that's a worry. That's a more general sort of political issue. But there is an argument that perhaps the way in which these protests were done, maybe putting quite a lot of people off, and of course disrupting, as they have done, transport and some of the facilities. I mean, that's been a problem, especially at the time when there's been a shortage, if you like, and concerns about the prices of oil at the pumps. And that has affected quite a lot of people's view of those protests. And yet, I think they were legitimate protests. And the question is how you do them. And I think that what we've heard today suggests that one will be very restricted in the future as to what one can do.
Thank you very much, Donica and Vicky, for joining us tonight on the show. Well, coming up in the next hour, as the government pledge a new crackdown on illegal protests, Trevor Phillips and his guests will be discussing whether climate activists are harming their own cause. That's on Common Ground at 9 o'clock. Well, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next.